And the way that the session has been planned is that we will have perspectives from speakers from across the stakeholder groups who will give us their perspectives on this debate. I will first start by explaining how this session is organized. It is a 3-hour session. It is a very long session. That's why we need to be kind of planned time-wise very well, because you will probably agree with me that we do not want to prolong this beyond the 3-hour mark. We will have 3 50-minute segments, each covering one of the topics I have described. And each speaker will have 4 minutes for their initial intervention. After that, we will continue with the Q&A session, with discussion, which will involve both of you sitting in this room here, as well as our remote participants, whom I would like to welcome as well. We will aim to be very transparent in the way that the microphone is handed. And the way it's going to work is that we would ask you all who would like to make a comment or ask a question to queue at the microphone here in front, on my right, on your left. So if you feel that you would like to pose a question, please take your time and move around. At the same time, we will have a transparent procedure for the online participants, which are handled by our colleague Diego Canabaro. So I hope this makes sense. If not, we will see how it works after the first segment, and I can always clarify, and we can figure out some details later. We will start the first issue that we will tackle in this session concentrates on the issue of internet disruptions. We will have, as I said, speakers from various stakeholder groups, but for the introductory remarks, I would first like to pass the floor to Henriette Esterhuizen. Welcome, and thank you for coming. Henriette is the Executive Director of the Association for Progressive Communications, APC, which is an international network of organizations working with ICT to support social justice and development. Prior to that, Henriette has served as the Director of Sangonet, which is the Internet service provider and training institution for civil society, labor, and community groups. Organizations. Now, Henriette, the question we would like to start, could you give us an overview on how has the debate around internet disruptions evolved in the past years? And what are the new motivations for disruptions and how they impact the global infrastructure of the internet? You have up to 5 minutes. Thank you.
And apologies for being late. I'm actually also not the executive director of APC any longer. I'm now the director of policy and strategy. I'm also very stupid when it comes to snow. I come from Johannesburg, sunny South Africa. I have no experience whatsoever, so I'm very sorry I'm late. I think the story about how the debate has evolved is actually quite a sad one, because on the one hand, there's more awareness of shutdowns. There's more discussion about shutdowns. There's been resolutions around how internet shutdowns actually disrupt people's ability to exercise their human rights through the internet at global level, at regional level, in Africa, at the African Commission. But shutdowns are actually, and disruptions are actually increasing. And there's a trend where there's an immediate reaction. The global community would react, local user community, even businesses would react. But then what next? There seems to be a gap of any real remedy or any real recourse to counter shutdowns. I think the other important difference, though, and I really have to commend Access Now as an organization that initiated a campaign called Keep It On, which now has very broad-based participation, and also various academics and people from the business community who've done research on the cost of internet disruptions and internet shutdowns. So I think the debate has evolved from one where it is a debate that has been led by human rights defenders, by journalists, who have approached it from a rights violation perspective, but increasingly the business community has come on board and has provided data on what the actual economic cost is of shutdowns. And I think where the debate needs to go next, perhaps, and it's beginning to emerge, is that with ICTs and the internet being such a vital part of people's lives in developing countries. It's a way in which people communicate with their families, do business, transact money, that these shutdowns actually have a very profound effect on people's daily lives, not just on their freedom to express. So, yes, I'm not sure if that covers it sufficiently as an opening statement, but I think that is, for me, the real concern is that even though there's more awareness, there's more exposure around shutdowns, they continue to happen. They happen in different ways. Sometimes they are complete shutdowns. Sometimes they're disruption of certain platforms or certain services. And I think the other thing to note as well is they happen everywhere. They happen in the Northern Hemisphere. They happen in the Southern Hemisphere. And I would like this process to actually produce some consensus on how multi-stakeholder cooperation can actually get teeth around this, and not for us to just bemoan the fact that these disruptions continue, because I think, and this will be my closing statement, I think that we talk about the multi-stakeholder approach and internet governance, but we, at a national level, for so many individual users of the internet, it's still the power of their states to instruct an operator or instruct a regulator to disrupt the internet in some way or other that has real impact. And that just blows the whole multi-stakeholder open approach to internet governance apart, in my view.
Andrea, thank you very much for setting the stage for the discussion and kind of bringing in the aspects that it's not only local to global impacts in the policy sense of view, but really issues that we as individuals need to take into account. I would like to go immediately to another lady on our panel, sitting on my right, Ms. Melody Partry from Access Now. Melody is the advocacy director at this organization, and she leads on the global advocacy, communications, and campaigns to protect the internet. And previously, she has worked very extensively on the issue on censorship and human rights. Looking at the civil society point of view, could you please tell us a bit more on the issue, how you see this, also bringing in some examples from the work of your organizations, and in particular, look at the local to global impacts. Over to you, Melody, 4 minutes, please.
Sure. Thank you very much, Teresa, and thank you, Henrietta, for the introduction previously about the work of Access Now as part of the Keep It On campaign. So Access Now is an organization defending and extending the digital rights of users at risk. And I'd like to start by giving you a few details about our work, in particular in the context of the Keep It On coalition. And I'd like to focus especially on how civil society can address this increasing and disturbing trend of intentional internet disruptions, namely via national and regional actions and policies that we can take. So the Keep It On campaign is a global coalition of over 140 members across 60 countries. The members are from multiple sectors, but mostly from civil society. And we have 4 pillars in our work on shutdown, which is advocacy, norm building, detection, and mitigation. This means that we are doing our utmost to record instances of internet shutdowns and internet disruptions across the world. We're also trying to provide solutions when they are available to the populations affected, whether it's via circumvention tools or other technical mechanisms that can be at our disposal when it is possible. And we're also trying to raise awareness on this issue and to engage with the authorities and with the different internet service providers and operators who are enforcing the orders to cut off the internet or to suspend or slow down connectivity or access to crucial user-to-user communications platform. What we have noticed is that, as Henrietta said, this trend of voluntary internet disruption is increasing. We have recorded, through our shutdown tracker optimization projects, 77 instances in 2017. And just to give you an idea, there were 18 instances recorded in 2015 and 56 in 2016. So this increase is really alarming, especially because, as was previously mentioned by Henrietta, it is mainly the single order of states to internet providers and operators to suspend or slow down or interfere in a way or another with the internet or with dedicated platforms that are primarily designed for user-to-user communication. So that includes WhatsApp, Twitter, Facebook, and so on. So as civil society, what can we do when indeed it looks like it's the state that is the main actor in this new trend? Well, one of the first things that we can do, especially at the local level, is to alert, when we can, the coalition and ask for solidarity to not just let the people know that a disruption is happening, but also to continue to alarm the authorities and to try to gather some interest to the situation that is happening. We're also trying to protect the communities affected, because something that has already been proved, and there is a lot of evidence and data supporting these findings, is that internet disruptions undermine human rights, and they have lots of other consequences. They harm local economies, they are detrimental to the work of emergency services, they isolate communities, and I think that it's quite fair to say that they impact all of our goals at the IGF. It's a really intersectional issue. And so further effort is required in terms of norm building, although we already have strong initiatives that we can build on, namely the UN resolution about the promotion, protection, and enjoyment of human rights on the internet. And last year, at around this period as well, 30 governments of the Freedom Online Coalition issued a historic statement against internet shutdowns. And I think that these initiatives should be pursued at the local level. I think that civil society actors can approach authorities either to review agreements and licenses with operators and telecommunication companies and internet service providers to make sure that licenses don't include unfair obligations to shut down the internet outside the rule of law. It is also necessary in some instances to encourage states to implement legislation that protects the internet. And these are just two examples that we can pursue, but it has to be said, though, that the states remain the main actors, although in 2016 we identified one instance of an internet shutdown that was perpetrated by a non-state actor. So I look forward to our discussion and to further engaging on local and regional solutions to this issue.
Thank you very much, Melody. That was useful to bring the perspectives, what the role of civil society and responsibilities of the civil society and finding solutions to the how to address the problem of interruptions where they lie. And thank you also for stressing the kind of local actions, the actions of the civil society that need to be taken on the local level, because very often these issues are very local. Before I get to our next speaker, I would just like to update, in particular, our online participants that the UN Secretariat is still working to get the captions from the session in. So it's a problem that is being looked at and tackled with urgency. Thank you once again, Melody, and coming to another lady on our panel, Ms. Farida Dwi Caharyani, who is the head of the Indonesian delegation here at the Internet Governance Forum. She serves as the Secretary General of the Ministry of Communication and Information Technology in Jakarta. And now, after we've heard some inputs from civil society, could you please tell us more from the government's point of view and some specificities in Indonesia? Ms. Farida, over to you. Thank you. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Sarah Sova. I would like to thank most developing countries have internet disruption. since they are still facing the digital divide. Example in Indonesia, as a developing country, has the same situation in which digital divide is our major challenges, especially the divergence of connectivity between the eastern part and the western part of Indonesia. It is for your information that Indonesia is archipelagic country having around 17,000 islands. In the geographical condition varies from one island to the other ones, and the remote area are higher than urban area. This situation is implying the condition I just mentioned earlier, that the bridging digital divide will be our concern in order to provide internet connectivity, available and affordability to public. Further, Indonesia also lies on the ring of fire that's often hit us in more vulnerable to the internet connection. For example, an earthquake hit on October last year in the coastal of Papua New Guinea, a neighbor of Indonesia. It caused telecommunication and internet disruption in the eastern parts of Indonesia, Jayapura. This is due to the breaking of marine cable in that region. Taking into account the above condition in which internet disruption will happen, the government of Indonesia is trying to provide the solution by rolling out the broadband fiber optic infrastructure project we call is Palaparing. This project is undergoing in the 3 regions, and it projected will conducted in last 2019. Palaparing is provided into 3 parts: in the west part, in the center part, and then also in the east part. There are 6,000 kilometers. Fiber optic will connect 440 cities or districts and on that region. Besides Palaparing, the government in collaboration with private sector also manage internet traffic with Indonesia Internet Exchange, also Indonesia Exchange Point. Now we are discussing our current policy and regulation. Government enables to terminate on access to the unlawful electronic information or content by electronic system provider. This is governed by Electronic Information and Transaction Law. We call is EIT law. I think this our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Farida, for complicating the issue by bringing another perspective of how natural disasters and similar events can have effect on internet disruptions. That was certainly useful for our session. Looking at the example of Indonesia, I would like to go to our next speaker, who will tell us more about some experience in Brazil. I would like to introduce to you Mr. Demigechko, who has been the key player on the team that established the first internet connection to Brazil. He's a member of the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee, CGIBR, and he played a critical role in the definition of the Brazilian domain name system tree and in defining the rules that govern the Brazilian registry. Demi, looking at the Brazilian case and the question of how disruptions affect specific countries, could you tell us more? Over to you with 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Okay, I will just give you first some context about the Brazilian situation. We are quite involved in the internet from 89, 91, more or less, and we began, as many countries, an academic initiative, and then the academic initiative expanded to the whole community. And we have some special situations in Brazil that in some way is related to the issue today. In 95, we created a committee, the steering committee, as Teresa said, that in some way gives structure to the work of the first academics and so. And now this is a multi-sectorial, multi-stakeholder body that predates even ICANN for some years. And another important issue in this area is that in Brazil, since the CGI, the steering committee, and since '95, internet is not considered a telecom issue, but an added value of the telecom infrastructure. And in this way, we have quite few regulations on the internet, and I think it's a good thing. Even in this situation of not having a strong regulation of the internet, we had some problems. I remember 2007, we have blockade in one platform, the YouTube, in that case, because of a video of a Brazilian model, so not important. But anyway, we as internet persons involved in this situation thought that it was quite a disproportionate measure, and the steering committee took 2 years to deliver a decalogue of principles that aimed to protect the main internet concepts. We presented this decalogue in IGF, if I remember, in Latvia, in Vilnius, not Latvia, yeah, and it was very well received. Since the promulgation of this decalogue, there was a lot of initiatives trying to build laws in the country. And we also, after 2 or 3 years of struggle, could get approved the civil framework of the internet. That is a kind of law that establishes the rules and the rights of the internet citizens beforehand of beginning to criminalize or try to take some measures on the dark part of the network. And I think this civil framework was also very well received from the internet community. We have a lot of good opinions on that. I remember it was signed in the beginning of the Net Mundial, an interesting conference in Brazil that delivered 2 documents. But just to go straight to the point, some thoughts of mine. I think internet, as the technical people are accustomed to say, brought a lot of rupture, disruption in many areas of the community. And along with disruptions, it's also some way not well understood what is the role of the thousands of networks that accomplishes the internet as a whole. First of all, there is no direct mapping between the networks, the autonomous systems, and the country boundaries. Then, if you want to some way shield the country from some kind of application or site, of course I'm not in favor of that, but this always has some kind of collateral effects in other regions or even in other countries, because the mesh of the networks that constitutes the internet has transit between parts of the autonomous system, has no direct mapping between these networks and the boundary, the countries, boundaries of the countries. Then, of course, if you don't take the right measures, and I don't think there are really right measures, your aim to blockade some platform or some site to your citizens normally has collateral effects much worse than you intended at first hand. If you add to this the losses, the financial losses you have in impeding your citizens to access normal services, it put in a balance, I suppose the result is not quite good. Then we are trying in the country to speak against laws or try to make this kind of suspension of services, because they are not effective in a technical way, and of course it's not appropriate also in keeping the internet whole as a whole, a single network for everyone. Then just to finish, I want to call your attention to the civil framework. We have 3 pillars in this law. One is the protect of the privacy, the other is the neutrality of the network, and the third one is the responsibility of the intermediaries in the process. And I think we get really a good set of laws trying to protect the internet in this in his basic concepts, and trying to keep the internet open and available to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Demi. I would like to maybe stress out one of the points that the effect of local action in internet disruption can never stay local because of the very nature of how the internet works. So that would be the key point from that I would take out from your intervention. Thank you very much. After Demi's perspectives, let us bring in another stakeholder group, being the private sector. We have with us here on the panel Mr. Christoph Steck from Telefonica. Christoph is the Director of Public Policy and Internet at the company, and he oversees the strategy and defines positions of the company on digital policy. To add more, he is the chairman of the IG working group of ETNO, the European Network Operators Association, and at the same time the co-chair of the Digital Economic Commission of the International Chamber of Commerce. Christoph, how are telecommunications providers affected by internet disruptions, and how do you suggest, from the company's point of view, to tackle the issue? Thank you. 4 minutes to you.
Thanks very much, and good morning to everyone. We are very much affected, of course, because our business is to offer access to the internet. So any disruption, of course, is affecting our business obviously very much. And I think actually it's not just the private sectors we have heard. I think we have a common interest as stakeholders between all groups to keep the internet working and to keep access to the internet. I would even go so far to say that network shutdowns are a kind of lose-lose position. I mean, basically everyone is losing. I don't see how you can really see a big benefit in shutting down services and the network especially. So the impact, you asked for the impact on us. I mean, it's very obvious that when we have to implement through our licenses, because we have obligations, our licenses when we operate, if we have to implement any kind of disruption, this has operational cost on us. It also has especially cost because usually our call centers, where the customers can call us, usually immediately go down because everyone calls and says what's going on. And we have, of course, a huge reputational impact because people in general do not like at all any kind of shutdown. So it's obvious that we have a business interest to keep the internet on as much as we can. I think we have to, I don't want to get into taxonomy of internet shutdowns, but I mean, there's of course a big difference between getting down the whole internet access network for all services. So basically the internet disappears, the access to the internet disappears in a certain region or in a country, which is of course the worst case, and service shutdowns, which is happening more frequently recently, which is basically that government usually wants to block access to a certain service, a certain application. I think the first one where networks are shut down, I think going forward, they are not sustainable, to be very honest. I think that the more you get into digital economies, the more you depend on connectivity. There's simply no way that you bring down the whole network. I mean, we go in great lengths to basically provide the internet without any disruptions, as we just heard from Indonesia, how complicated that is. And basically, I mean, to bring it down, basically on due to the pure will of someone or a government, I mean, that makes totally no sense. I mean, all kind of services depend on that, and we heard that from Andrea already. Financial services, health, even the functioning of the proper government agencies depends on that. So I think this is not going to, I mean, it cannot be sustainable the more you get into more developed economies. Having said that, I mean, service shutdown, so picking out a specific service on the internet and shutting down the access to it is, of course, something which we see raising. Again, I mean, I think there are different motivations for doing that. Sometimes you see it ahead of elections in some countries, which are usually not the most democratic ones, and where you see that, basically there's a will to bring down services to avoid too much of policy engagement. But sometimes you see it even in democratic states. There was a case in Brazil, despite the net neutrality laws and everything, a judge ordered shutting down access to WhatsApp for 24 hours to all operators in the country. That make a lot of headlines because actually Brazil is, of course, a democratic country, and so that was an interesting case, and maybe we can discuss it later on. What's the problem here? Usually the argument from government side is national security. Usually there's always a reason why, operators, for example, have obligations, legal obligations in their licenses provided by the governments that we have to implement that. So what's the way forward? What's the solution? I think, first of all, we have to work together. We have to work together to raise awareness, and we are doing that together with a lot of other companies from the technology sector and operators in GNI, the Global Network Initiative, which is trying to make exactly that, raise awareness, engage, and try to make sure that this is that governments understand that this is not a good idea. But apart from that, I suppose we should also think about, in a case that really governments or a judge, for example, which is not exactly government, decides to do it, what are the processes of doing that? Because sometimes the process can help here. So we believe that it needs to be very transparent, because sometimes it's not transparent. Sometimes these are orders coming to someone, and it's not transparent that the government is behind that. And so basically we need transparency from governments. We're trying to do whatever we can, of course, being transparent as a company if that happens to us, but we basically also ask governments to do that. There needs to be adequate oversight mechanisms. It can, of course, not be that it's an easy thing to shut down access to any service on the internet. Let's be fair. There are huge human rights implications here, and despite the fact that there might be an argument, we need to have a proportionality test here, and basically this needs to be a high barrier, it needs to be adequate oversight. And I think we need redress mechanisms. Once that happens, how can you really go and redress and go against it? In the case of Brazil, for example, there was redress to other judges in the court system, and finally the decision was overruled. So I think this shows that you have to also have a redress mechanism, even in cases where you have a legal way of shutting down access to a certain service. So that would be my first remarks.
Thank you. With telco companies being such an important player, obviously your enlightening of the situation from the business perspectives and your interest in that is very relevant for this discussion. Which leads us to the formal part of the panel with the interventions, and the remaining time that we have available here should serve for a discussion. Once again, for those of you that have joined the session a bit later, we would like to follow a transparent procedure of you asking the question. So if you have a question, comment, or an intervention, please be so kind and come here to front. And we will use the order in which you stand there. You can pose a question in general or a comment to either of our speakers, or you can also obviously pose the question to specific speakers, commenting on their previous interventions. The same procedure would be valid for our online participants, and I will be waiting for my colleague Diego to alert me when we bring them in. Before you speak, with the exception of Mr. Vint, Cerf, can you please introduce yourself and state your affiliation?
There. Amazing. Maybe I should say nothing now. My name is Vint Cerf. I am representing Google today, but I wish to speak on behalf of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. Those of you who were around for day zero will know that a publication was made from the New Delhi meeting describing an attempt to defend what they call the public core of the internet from interference. And some of what we have just heard about could be considered interference with the operation of that public core. So I guess I would like very much to invite comment from the panel on the importance and utility of the statements coming from the Global Commission as a means of drawing attention to the harms that some of you have already alluded to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cerf. Would any of the speakers on the panel, as well as any of our speakers for the next segments, like to answer? Henriette, please.
Thank you very much, Vint. You helped me. I was going to bring that up myself. Having had the privilege of working on this commission, absolutely, I think that can help. What the commission has done is to develop a norm, and I'll read it. Its title is Non-Interference with the Public Call. Without prejudice to their rights and obligations, state and non-state actors should not conduct or knowingly allow activity that intentionally and substantially damages the general availability or integrity of the public core of the internet, and therefore the stability of cyberspace. And I won't go into the detail of what this means, but I think what this signifies is that different stakeholders can come together and develop some normative guidelines that can then be adopted and adhered to. And if not adhered to, accountability can be demanded on that. Because I think there's a little bit of a vacuum. I think, as Christoph said, national security is often used as the premise for internet disruptions. There's lack of transparency, lack of due process. And that's become the norm. So what we need are different norms which actually can be used to hold those actors involved in these disruptions accountable. And I think from a civil society perspective, we also need to be able to hold the private sector accountable. And I think one of the challenges here is that when you do challenge the private sector, they often say, we had no choice. It's in our licensing agreement with the telecoms regulator that we have to follow these instructions. And I think in terms of changing this and really stopping this from happening, we need to be able to have recourse where we can challenge states and operators and not allow them to blame one another. Yes, I think this norm, Vint, definitely can make a contribution.
Thank you very much, Henriette. I would like now to go to an online discussion. Do we have a question, Diego, from the online space? Then we go immediately back to you.
Yes, we do, Teresa. Mr. Gechko mentioned net neutrality as one of the pillars of internet policy in Brazil. How do you think that each country's net neutrality position and regulation affects cross-border access, thinking of how local interventions affect global impacts? The speaker is not identified.
Mm-hmm. Very timely issue of network neutrality. Over to you, Mr. Gechko.
Very quickly. I think neutrality is more related to the internet providers, and providers is more related to the national structure, to the local structure. Of course, there will be some effects if you drop the neutrality in other places of the world because of platforms you normally use. But of course, I think this is more a geolocated problem if you deal with the local providers. And of course, there is a lot of discussion on that. But in Brazilian case, we have this written in the law, in the Brazilian civil framework, that you have to provide the internet in the same fashion you got it from the others. Then you, as a provider, cannot alter or change or in some way interfere on what your customers are finding and looking and searching in the internet. But this is a complex issue, of course.
Thank you, Demi. For any questions, because we have, for your information, not more than 10 minutes to continue with Q&A. Please limit to 2 minutes max. Same for questions and answers. If possible, shorter. Over to you. Please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Chaturvedi. I come from India. I head Public Affairs and Policy for the Cellular Operators Association of India. We have over 1 billion connections, and yet when it comes to numbers, there's a paradox. Just 28% of India is online, which also means that we have a lot more we need to bring online. When we look at another equation, there are just 26% of that who are women. So my question really is to Henriette and to Christopher. I hear you, Christopher, when you talk about the fact that there are internet shutdowns. And let us remind everyone, it affects business, which means we're losing billions of dollars when we're told to shut down the net for over 14 days at a stretch because there were some local exams which were taking place and there was a possibility of cheating. So it's not like the private sector enjoys shutting down the internet. What we do call for, and which is the core of this discussion, which is enhanced collaboration and cooperation. So it's easy to point fingers, but it would be wonderful to hear from the panel if we can look at multi-stakeholders on the panel proposing a way forward on how we can work together where when we're called to order, and we are licensees, we're obliged to shut the net down when the government asks us to do that. So these are real problems, and we don't want to brush them under the carpet. My second important question is to Henriette. When we speak about the public core and ransomware, WannaCry, these are real instances which have had a ripple effect. So while we understand that there are several layers and applications to internet governance, if we can speak a little more on a Geneva-like convention perhaps, because the time is really now when we could truly work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Subita. First to Christoph, then to Henriette with their reactions. 1 minute, please, if you can. Thank you.
Well, I think I totally agree. I tried to say that before, that we have no business interest of doing that. I mean, so if you have a private company, I mean, of course, not all operators in the world are private companies. Some are state-owned. But if you have a private company, you will not see anyone, saying hooray when you have to intervene your service, which you're offering to your customers. So that's for sure. What can we do? As I said, I think we need to kind of, first of all, fight for, the right legal frameworks, that if the things happen, there are redress mechanisms. You have to be able to go to somewhere else and say that this was not the proportionate measure. I think the case from India, I mean, I don't know it in detail, but it sounds like a weird case, So it sounds like a case you should not really shut down the internet for cheating on exams. I mean, that's obvious. I mean, there might be other situations where there might be a good reason to do it. And I think there are people who should take these decisions in an objective and neutral manner and not by political incentives. So I think I would ask for this kind of framework where you can basically redress mechanisms. Apart from that, we have to lobby together and we have to speak to governments together to make them aware that this is really a bad idea.
Yes, thank you for bringing in the practical aspects. Quick update, live captioning is on. Thank you, IGF Secretariat. Now our online participants can have the full experience. Quickly with a reaction to Henriette, then Melody, and then we move to another question from online participants.
I'll try to be very quick. I think just on the first question, I want to affirm what Christoph said. I think you cannot solve social problems or problems within the public sector, the educational system, or lack of effective protection of children in your society, in the offline world, by disrupting or overly filtering or blocking content flows in the online world. So I do think there's a tendency sometimes for states to look at quick solutions to quite deep-seated problems, and that just doesn't work. On the question about the treaty or the convention, I'm not saying that that's not one day possible. I think what we're trying to do with the work of the Commission, and it's very easy, go and look at it at cyberstability.org, is to see if we can get this non-binding, this norm adopted. And with that norm comes the notion that the internet is public, that it belongs to all of us, not public in the sense that governments can control it, but public in the sense of a common resource. And if we can get massive or wide range, multi-stakeholder support for this norm, that the public core of the internet should not be disrupted, then perhaps that can lead to a more firm binding agreement. But we would like to start with promoting the idea of this norm at this point.
Thank you, Henriette. Melody?
No, I just wanted to quickly jump on the fact that India ordered the government shutdown with the justification to prevent cheating during school exams. It's actually not a unique case. in 2016 and 2017, we recorded over 30 instances of internet shutdowns around the world during school exams. So this justification alone, it took place in India, it took place in a number of countries in Africa, in the Middle East. So this justification is a serious issue, and actually it's not the only justification that is used to justify shutdowns. Sometimes, you know, you can also question the goodwill of the governments and whether they really believe that cutting off the internet will prevent exams. Sometimes you notice that these shutdowns happen at the same time as social unrest and protests. So these are all considerations that we have to take into our mind when talking about possible remedies and means to redress and also contest at court these orders.
Thank you. So from the global problem of exam cheating, I apologize, there is no question online, so we can go directly to you. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for the presentations. My name is Patricia. I'm a fellow at the Internet Society Project at Yale Law School. And I have a question specifically referring to this difference in the taxonomy about the Internet the shutdown of the entire infrastructure, not the applications. The whole debate usually points to developing countries or authoritarian regimes. But I would like to ask to the members of the panel, this practice, as far as I know, has also been in the debate of the well-consolidated democracy, probably for very different reasons that authoritarian regimes or developing countries. How do they do it? Well, by affecting some layers of the TCP/IP protocol. So I would like to ask you, how much do you know about this debate and these incidents in the well-established democracies? Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia, for your question. Would anybody from the panel like to tackle this one? Would you like to? Melody?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the specifics, but something that we did at Access Now as part of the Keep It On campaign, and thanks to all of our members in our efforts to record and monitor instances of shutdowns, is we also look at the justifications that are used and also at the technicality that is being used, whether it's even like slowing down the connection or any form of interference with communications and internet connectivity. And we developed, thanks to our tracker, we have this map that shows the number of countries. And indeed, if you look at the map, you will see that it's not just authoritarian countries and developing countries. There were also allegations that Spain, during the Catalonian referendum, somehow interfered with connections in the Catalonian region. So we really need to be more cautious and very alert at the countries that are implementing shutdowns and looking at the justifications that are used and the technical means that are used to bar or prevent or slow down connections.
Thank you very much, Melody. We will need to speed up in order to accommodate two of you, if possible, at least. Please, over to you.
Is it? Yeah. Ian Brown speaking here only in a personal capacity. I know Henriette does a lot of work on human rights, and others have mentioned that topic. I co-authored a report for the Global Network Initiative a couple of years ago called Digital Freedoms in International Law, and we addressed many of the issues that have been talked about. Those rights are already there in international law. So I think as a multi-stakeholder process, we need to find ways to involve, the UN, the Human Rights Council, the Human Rights Committee, and then at the regional and national human rights authorities to start enforcing these rights and doing all the good things that the Telefonica gentleman was mentioning about oversight and proportionality and remedies and recourse. They're all there.
Thank you. Ian, would you like to react, Chris?
You're absolutely right. There is no accountability. It doesn't mean we should not try to use these mechanisms. I think what we need to do is to use them in a more concerted way, to use global, regional, and national mechanisms, and to get serious cooperation. And as I said in my opening statement, Ian, I think we also need to be willing to be a little bit more disruptive in how we practice the multi-stakeholder approach. I think we sometimes hold back from really confronting actors who violate rights. And I think that the approach should be able to accommodate that confrontation and holding actors accountable.
Thank you. Ms. Farida, would you like to elaborate a bit on the global norms aspects of that?
Thank you, Mrs. Moderator. Indonesia has agenda to digital economy, and the secure, stable is definitely within our agenda. I think Indonesia is open. It is gathering with another partner for the democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will move. If you cooperate, Bertrand, and limit 3 30-second quick questions so that we can have everybody, because we will have to move to the next segment. Then we will be fine. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Bertrand de la Chapelle. I'm the Executive Director of the Secretariat of Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. Just a quick point to complement what Demi was saying regarding the question of the collateral impact or the transboundary impact. For your information, the Council of Europe in 2011 had a recommendation that included a provision regarding the necessity for national governments to make an assessment of the transboundary impact of any national decision. The second element is, Henriette was mentioning the core, and there was a discussion about, we use the expression, the common heritage of mankind for other things. Actually, the internet is the common creation of mankind. And the final element, we mentioned the WhatsApp or the blocking that might happen at a technical level. Sometimes we pay too much attention to the symptom, and sometimes we need to look at the cause. And here the cause is the problem that access to user data for criminal investigation is not a problem that is solved. And I just want to highlight this.
Thank you, Bertrand. I take it as a comment. Yes, rather. Thank you, please.
Hi, I'm Abdullah Salmi. I work as Internet Freedom Analyst with the BBC World Service. And basically, to get to the point, I think there is a need for better monitoring of Internet shutdowns. Access Now have been doing a lot of great work, but there are always approaches that we can use, because if people in countries where the internet is shut down don't have access to the internet, then how are we going to know that there's no internet? And the second point is that I noticed that governments often seek to target the internet because it's a soft target, and they really fear the spread of information, and I think that their adversaries will always use the internet to get back at them. And for that, I think there is a need for the civil society to engage in building the capacity of governments and using the internet to actually improve peace and security and communicate better with their audiences. So, yeah, that's it for now.
Thank you very much. I also take this as a comment. Last, please, Fiona.
Fiona Songa, CEO of TESPOC, the Kenya Internet Exchange Point. Mine is a comment to support the entire discussion we've had on internet shutdowns. And I speak here wearing several hats. A number of you know me as one of the co-authors of a proposal that we tabled for the African Internet Registry to shut down governments that shut down the internet. But why we're doing that is because we wanted to engage the governments where there is no engagement with the government by the technical community, not the civil society. The technical community, the owners of the infrastructure. There are no internet shutdowns. Kenya is a case study. We've had a lot of upheaval in Kenya in the last 1 year because of elections, because of exam cheatings, but we never shut down the internet. Instead, the internet was used to make the exam results better and more accurate, instead of it being shut down because of the cheating, and the cheating issue was addressed differently because it's a different kind of a problem. Because of all the election upheaval and the reruns of the elections and everything we've done, there was a lot of social media instability and everything, communication and everything, but we were able to work with the government, and we were able to, as the private sector, as the owners of the content management platforms and the infrastructure, and we were able to solve the specific problems. What many governments don't know is that it is technically possible to address specific problems on the internet. And if we don't teach them that, then they will say no. There's a problem on WhatsApp, block WhatsApp. There's a problem on Twitter, block Twitter. Block Facebook, block this. Shut down the entire internet. We don't want emails. Why? Because they don't understand. But it is the responsibility of the technical community, the people who build the infrastructure, who set up all these platforms, to be able to educate government on what is possible and what is not possible, and what can be achieved, because if we then collaborate in that setting, we can achieve much more. When civil society come in, civil society sometimes don't also understand the issues that the investors into that infrastructure are going through. So, and that is why my take, from a business point of view, is that this is a discussion that should happen between the owners of the infrastructure, the technical community, and the government, so that we build capacity in government to help them address very specific issues online. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fiona, for this comment, which certainly follows the logics of this session, where we try to have a dialogue about it. This is not an issue or responsibility of a single stakeholder group, and we are happy to have the technical community to join this discussion. I would like now to ask you to join me, thank Demi, Melody, no longer present Thomas, Ms. Parrida, Christophe and Henriette for their excellent contributions at this panel. And we will now have a quick speaker reshuffle. Thank you. Please join our table in the middle. Do not leave the room, because we would very much welcome your contributions for the segments of encryption and data flows. And I would now like to invite Rihanna, Raul, Luis Fernando, Paul Nicolas, and Mektar to join me up front. Thank you. There are some disruptive elements in the session.
Maybe you want to keep this free?
No. This is perfect. Thomas is not coming. It's perfect. So here we go. We are starting the second segment of this main session. Welcome to anybody who has joined us right now. This is a session looking at the local interventions and global impacts on the issues of internet disruptions, encryption, and data flows. And we are entering the second segment. I would first like to give the floor to my colleague on my right, Ms. Rihanna Pfefferkorn, who is the Cryptography Fellow at the Stanford Center for Internet and Society. Her work concentrates on investigating and analyzing the US government's policy and practices for forcing decryption and influencing crypto-related design of online platforms and services, devices, and products. Rihanna, how do you think the debate around encryption has evolved to a point where it poses a threat to public and national security that we believe might require an international action? You have 5 minutes, please.
Well, I'd like to start by saying that encryption is not a security threat. Encryption promotes public security, both in both senses that Henriette mentioned, both as to countries and to individuals. And I'd say it's vital that the world's democracies respect and support the use of strong encryption, both for communications and for stored data. And that's for at least 2 reasons. The first reason is that encryption is very important to human rights, which is a point I think I probably hardly need to make before a group like this. It protects activists, dissidents, journalists, NGO workers, and minorities, be they religious, ethnic, sexual, or political minorities, from governments that don't respect human rights. So, if a democracy that purports to respect human rights stands up and says we don't support strong encryption, that makes it easier for oppressive countries to stand up and say neither do we. And if those countries undermine encryption, they make it harder to use strong encryption in devices or in apps or other software or for web traffic, then the people that they persecute within their borders will have weaker security, and they're at greater risk of persecution from their governments. So, if a democracy says it supports human rights and yet refuses to support strong encryption, is giving cover to oppressive countries to carry out the very persecution that the democracy says it abhors. And it's given up the moral standing to push back against that persecution. So if a democracy says, we need to undermine encryption so that we can investigate crime, it's harder for it to criticize a repressive regime that is doing the same thing, but the crime in question is saying something bad about the king or being gay. The second reason that it's important for democracies to back strong encryption is that, again, I hardly need to say this here, but we're all interconnected. We might use a mobile device that's made in one country, running an operating system that's made in another country, and on that mobile OS, maybe we're using an app that's made in country number 3 to access an account that we have on a server that's physically located in country number 4, and maybe we personally are located in none of those countries at all, country number 5, like many of us probably are right now. So, if one country bans strong encryption and a company in that country weakens its services encryption to comply with the law, that undermines the security of all of the company's users worldwide, not just the users in jurisdiction. So, information security is a global matter. It's also a temporal matter in that laws that weaken encryption today by mandate will end up having consequences in the future that we may not even understand today. We already have seen in the past how the USA's previous regulations on export-grade cryptography had security ramifications years after the fact, even in the last couple of years, well after the United States lifted those export restrictions. And the flip side of this is that if one country bans strong encryption but other countries don't, then there's an incentive for some entities to move to those latter jurisdictions so that they can keep doing business without weakening their products and without losing users. And that makes the first country's ban kind of pointless. All they did was push the entity to a place outside the reach of its laws that it's trying to regulate, and it may not even be able to keep its own citizens from accessing those encrypted products and services because they're still available from abroad. Or, if the country technically blocks users from accessing those encrypted services after they've moved abroad, then those users may turn to less secure alternatives. And that just has the effect of placing the country's own citizens at greater risk because they've forbade strong crypto and now its own users are using something that provides weaker security than would be available from abroad. But it also puts those users who do still use products after they've moved abroad at the mercy of whatever the new host country's laws are. So maybe the new host country that an entity moves to doesn't ban strong encryption, but maybe it has other laws about cybersecurity or privacy or bulk surveillance or data localization or restrictions on free expression that will still end up affecting those users, assuming that the entity complies with all of its new host country's laws. So, if the world's democracies chase away the developers of encrypted devices and services off to countries that have laws that those democracies aren't okay with, then those democracies end up subjecting their own citizens to those other countries' laws as an unintended consequence of their own laws about encryption. And so those are a couple of the reasons I wanted to highlight for democratic countries that have a strong rule of law to realize that strong encryption promotes the rule of law and promotes public security. It doesn't undermine it the way that so many law enforcement officials, even in democratic countries, are so fond of saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Rihanna. That was a great intervention on the spillover effects of the local actions. Thank you also for respecting the time perfectly. And now we will bring in perspectives from various stakeholder groups. And I would like to start with the colleague of my left from the technical community, Mr. Raul Echeverria. He's the Vice President of Global Engagement at the Internet Society, and he's the former CEO of LACNIC and a former MAC member. Raul, what are some of the dilemmas in the debate on encryption in the spirit of this session?
Hello. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak in this session. I think that Rihanna almost covered everything, so it makes my work much easier. I would like to take some of the ideas that she already mentioned, but encryption should not be encryption should be the norm and should not be seen as a barrier for cybersecurity, and instead as a critical tool for strengthening the user safety and human rights. The issue with encryption is that you either have it or not, and there is nothing in between. And so the choice is very easy. So we don't have too many options. Law enforcement agencies and also intelligence agencies claim to have options to access encrypted contents and communications. And it is important to make a distinction here. It's not the same. Sometimes we just speak about governments in general, but it's not the same when we speak about law enforcement agencies that have legitimacy under their local laws. And it's a different thing when we speak about intelligence agencies that are just motivated by the desire of doing surveillance, massive surveillance. So it's absolutely different. The issue with the law enforcement agencies is that there is an illusion there is an illusion somewhere that some people have this illusion that encryption, tools for breaking encryption could be available only for the good guys. And this is a very common. We see that in the speeches. And in this world, the bad news is that it's very difficult to differentiate who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. It's not like movies. That is much easier. But even if we would be able to define who are the good guys, it is impossible to provide warranties that the tools for breaking encryption would be available only for them. And it is plenty of examples of how technologies that have been used by intelligence agencies at the end of the day are available for hackers and for other people. And some governments would like to have those instruments available only for them, but I'm sure they don't want the same tools that would be available for other governments. So that's it make it very complex. Or not, or it make it simple. And so the encryption, why encryption is important, and Rihanna covered it very well, is important for protecting personal data, is important for companies' information, and it's important for protecting government interests, and in different ways. The economy today is based on many activities that happen in the digital world. So the security of the information is very important for the stability of the economy. So look at if the encryption in financial transactions is broken, so it will have a huge impact in the economy of the countries. But this is important also for, as I said before, for the confidentiality of the communications of the government, and also for businesses of the governments, like paying taxes. No, the governments need secure ways of collecting money from the taxpayers. So this is also important in that sense. It is very important because it's important for enhancing freedom of the people, of course. In a few words, our life is a digital life at this moment, at least for half of the population of the world. And so we need tools for protecting our privacy, our interests, and our freedom in that world, in the digital world. So the real dilemma is how to provide tools for law enforcement agencies without affecting the trust of the internet. This is through collaboration. So we need to find other ways to provide. We need other ways to work together for providing tools that don't affect the trust of the internet. And collaborative security, working together, is the best way forward. In the Internet Society, we have very successful experiences working with the African Union. We developed last year what we call the Internet Infrastructure Cybersecurity Guidelines. This is the way forward, working together among all stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raul. It's a hard job stopping you because you have excellent interventions, but the other choice is I get criticized for doing a bad job. Excellent intervention on the dilemmas. Thank you very much for that, Raul. I would like now to go to the perspectives from the international organizations' point of view to Mokhtar. Mokhtar Yadali is the head of the Information Society Division at the African Union Commission. He's an engineer with MBA in International Business, and he has more than 20 years of international experience in communication and networks management. Now, Mokhtar, Africa is one of the unique regions that has put together the Convention on Personal Data Protection already in 2010. you were visionary in a sense because you envisaged the link between data protection and cybersecurity. Could you tell us more about that? Again, keeping it with the spirit of the session of the local actions and global impact. 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. To make it very good, I will just display a few slides I had a chance to present quickly. And if you allow me, I will be speaking in French. The reason in being is to show kind of diversity within the Internet governance forums and to allow the interpreters, some of them, to rest a little bit because speaking all the time English will be... Right. So, but this minute doesn't count on my time, by the way.
It doesn't because you have the presentation, you can see the timer, but I have the timer here.
Alors, je voudrais tout...
So I'd just like to say that Africa, or the African Union Commission, saw a long time ago that it was important to provide Africa with a certain framework which would allow it to benefit from the technology advances. You know that we cannot miss that turning point. We cannot fail to use the new technologies for our own purposes, and especially the transactions in terms of health, education, and so on. So the heads of African state and government decided to set in place a convention on cybersecurity and transactions, and especially on the protection of private data. That's extremely important, and it is the only convention in the world today which deals with data protection, because there are two types of convention, the Budapest Convention and the African Union Convention. One relates to cybercrime, and the other relates primarily to data protection and data transmission and so on. So this convention is made up of 3 main parts. And one of the main reasons which led to the establishment of this convention, well, actually there are 3 reasons. The first relates to the fact that Africa is now a leader in financial transactions worldwide. The second is that the introduction of what we call digital identities, such as electronic passports and IDs, for example, have led to a number of questions with respect to democracy and elections. You will recall the Rwanda genocide, where a certain number of ethnic groups were identified, and subsequently it was essential for us to ensure that there was a convention in place to protect all private data. And so the next slide, please. Next slide. Could we? So the convention is made up of 3 parts. So the first relates to electronic transactions, the second to personal data protection, and the third to the promotion of cybersecurity and the combating cybercrime. What is crucial, could we go back? Thank you. The convention defines cryptology and cryptology activities. It also specifies the tools and means available for cryptology, and it includes coding and encryption. It identifies what authorized access is, it defines what health data is, and also what the interconnection of personal data is, and that's the topic of our session today. Moreover, it defines personal data, a personal data file, the processing of personal data, the obligations and duties of those who receive personal data that has been processed. It defines secret conventions and especially sensitive data. And I'll stop here because I think my speaking time is up, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. You kept within the limit perfectly. Thank you for bringing in this case that you have implemented in your region. That was certainly useful for the discussion, and we can come back to it in the discussion. Alert that also for this session, if you want to intervene, ask a question, we will be using a queue here at the microphone in front on your left. Feel free to stretch your legs and move in that direction already to assure your spot. I would like now to move to Luis Fernando Garcia, who is the Executive Director and co-founder of R3D, the Digital Rights Defense Network, which is a Mexican organization that defends human rights online. He is a law graduate that has worked as a policy fellow at Asociación por los Derechos Civiles in Argentina, and he's got an ample experience in human rights and technology issues. Can you talk to us a little bit more on the risks of encryption?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I want to reiterate it because it's important to make sure that everyone understands at the personal level why encryption and privacy is important. And maybe many people here understand it, but I want to give some examples on why and what the extent of the importance of this is. And of course, encryption and anonymity provide essential protections for security, privacy, and freedom of expression. But for example, in Mexico, journalists are under constant threat from private and public actors. In the last 15 years, more than 100 journalists have been killed or disappeared. This has created several problems with regard to the flow of information in Mexico. It has even created what we're calling zones of silence, places in which violence is so grave that traditional media do not dare to report on what's going on those zones. And it is in these zones in which digital media and digital journalists have become some of the only sources for information. And for them, privacy and encryption are essential tools to protect their lives and protect the lives of their sources. So I wanted to mention this to understand the value of encryption in a context like this. And because of this, many civil society groups have invested lots of resources and time in teaching journalists on how to protect their privacy and how to use and adopt encryption. Definitely we've seen a lot of progress in the adoption of encryption from many companies, and I think that's great progress. However, I want to raise a problem that is now evolving. Now, the attackers, and I really agree with what Mr. Echeverria was saying, particularly in a place like Mexico, you cannot really differentiate between the good guys and the bad guys so easily. You cannot paint the government as the good guys and other people as the bad guys, because in reality, in the ground, this is mixed up. There's people in the government that work for organized crime and vice versa. So a trend that we're very concerned is that given this proliferation of encryption, now bad guys, both in government or outside of government, are using tools like malware attacks that circumvent the problem of encryption. And particularly, they are buying those capabilities from commercial vendors. In a way, we are very concerned that encryption is leading this trend into governments like Mexico or Ethiopia and others purchasing these tools to circumvent the encryption and to target journalists and human rights defenders, as it has been revealed in the last year. So I really want to leave the discussion for now with this idea on we need to think about, of course, keep pushing for encryption adoption, but do not forget that there is this problem here. And it's a particularly important problem because in a way, many governments like Mexico are investing and giving money to an economy that is dedicated to break our equipment, to break our software. And this creates this is a local problem that creates a broader problem. We are fueling an industry that is harming the trust and the safety of the devices and of the internet in reality. So we need to figure out multi-stakeholder approaches to really make this type of actions accountable, and this type of governments and other actors accountable for disrupting, not only affecting the lives and security and safety of journalists and human rights defenders, but the overall trust and resilience of the internet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis Fernando, on bringing in the examples from Mexico and related issues of strong encryption and human rights. This gives also a very nice bridge to the intervention that we will have from the private sector. And I would like to welcome here Mr. Paul Nicolas, who is the Senior Director at Microsoft, where he leads the Global Security Strategy and Diplomacy team, which focuses on advancing cybersecurity, cloud computing, and risk management. And prior to joining Microsoft in 2005, Paul has worked in the US government focusing on emerging threats. Paul, please tell us more about the perspective from the private sector on encryption and your opinion on the nature of international cooperation that we should seek here. 4 minutes to you.
Terrific, thank you. First of all, I couldn't agree more with some of the statements that have been made by my colleagues on the panel. I think the world is going through a profound period of diffusion. We're watching a diffusion of power and of insecurity and of opportunity at a scale that I don't think we've ever seen before. And in some ways, rapid advances in internet connectivity and advances in cloud computing are taking ideas and capital further than we've seen them go, probably at any point in human history. But this shift is making some governments really nervous, and it's causing them to want to try to block encryption, weaken encryption, because ideas are powerful. As a provider of technology, we look around the world, and I think in some ways, not to seem like I'm reflecting things that have been stated, but you know, encryption saves lives. As Rihanna, I think, just artfully talked about, you know, whether you're a member of a minority community or a journalist or human rights worker, in many parts of the world, encryption is what protects you and your family and your business. And secondly, encryption is core to how we manage risk in the modern enterprise. It is how you protect data. It is how you protect operations. I think after the Snowden allegations of 2013, you saw many governments many enterprises really reinvigorate their view of encryption, looking at how do they actually implement end-to-end encryption, what are the things they need to do. And so I think there have been some really positive advancements in that space as people start to take a new look at risk management and the types of things that are capable for them. But I also think it's really interesting. James Comey made a statement in the recent past that goes something like this: "I love strong encryption. It protects us in many ways from bad people, but it takes us to a place we have not been before: absolute privacy." And I think that in some ways sums up the challenge that we have in many respects with governments when it comes to law enforcement. And what is the appropriate balance between this? And as a private sector company, we live in the middle of this space. How do you strike that balance between providing strong products that protect your customers no matter where they are in the world and in the various jurisdictions that they travel? And I thought your point, Rihanna, was great about the fact that nobody stays in one place anymore. People are mobile, and you have to live and survive in different environments. But what is that structure that provides appropriate law enforcement access? How do you establish something that is both principled, protecting of human rights, and actually something that does not undermine the fundamentals of the technology? And for that, we actually do need a multi-stakeholder approach. We have to find that balance. And there was something that Henrietta said, I think, on the first panel that was really important. We have to find a way to hold others accountable for enforcing human rights and protecting those human rights. And I don't know how we do that. I think there's a lot of different ideas on the table, certainly in the law enforcement space. Several companies have come together under the rubric of reform government surveillance to put ideas out there. But then there is the other issue that we still have to think about, and that is it's not just governments that have the ability to break encryption. It is also criminals and others who will use that technology to undermine. So we have to have a joint solution that allows us to cross boundaries if we're going to succeed.
And you finished 1 second before your timer went off. Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Not only for that, but also for this very accurate intervention. Talking to us about the challenges that you as a private sector are facing. You've said that encryption saves lives. Also coming back to the point that Henriette said at the very beginning of the session when she kind of discussing the issues of disruptions, encryption in general, that these are issues that are of immediate concern to us as individuals, not only as the policy issue. Thank you, which leads us to the questions and answers segment. We have about 20 minutes. We are using the queue. If you want to make an intervention, comment, or question, please make your way to the microphone. Supita, please introduce yourself again as we have people changing in the room. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the floor. My name is Dr. Subi Chaturvedi. I come from CUI. I work on policy and public affairs. It really warms my heart when I hear you say that encryption truly is the defender of human rights. We have an interesting problem when we're looking at governments across the world, especially developing countries and emerging economies. While the Reserve Bank of India calls for 48-bit encryption, the licensor calls for 68-bit encryption. So you, when you're working in fintech especially, are in constant danger of being in violation of one law enforcement agency or another ministry. What is wonderful to look at is if we can look at governments not working in silos and also look at national and global processes where maybe an intersessional that looks at best practices, encryption and privacy. What is also amazing about the IGF is the fact that there is no one stakeholder which is dominant, and every single stakeholder is equally important, has a say at the table. That brings me to Garcia. When we looked at WannaCry ransomware, we also looked at vulnerabilities that governments held against corporations. I'll just rest here. When we're looking at cases like Uber, we're looking at states and cities bringing about class action suits, bringing about cases. So if we can look at accountability from the government, if we could just speak to that a little. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sube. Please, because the line is getting bigger, limit your question to 1 minute max and the answers, if possible, 30 seconds. Mr. Garcia, would you like to react to Sube's question?
Yeah, very rapidly. I think governments have shown not to be able to protect secrets about how to break into computers and software. The cases that were mentioned, for example, the U.S. government having the ability to perform very sophisticated attacks, and they lost that knowledge, and that was used against their own citizens and other companies. So when we're talking about encryption about maybe creating a key that only the government can use, I think there's lots of evidence that governments, when they have this power, they abuse it, or even when they are willing to just use it in legitimate ways, they are not able to protect that knowledge just for themselves. So I think that's why this is not a road that we can go forward with the problem with encryption and legitimate interventions by authorities.
Thank you, Luis Fernando. Please, the floor is yours. You have a timer at front, should it help you. Thank you.
Okay. Elliot Benginelli speaking. I'm here by myself, and I really agree on everything that has been said about encryption and how it protects human rights, but I have this question about what is being done to support the technologies that are working on encryption tools. And I know a lot of open source software such as VeraCrypt or PGP. They've been facing struggle at some point in terms of people working, developers, or even people working on a communication side, on writing to guides, translation and stuff like that. And I would like to know if the private sector and the public sector, what is their investment or commitment on this point, because we rely on tools that are not being supported enough, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Paul, would you like to react to this?
Sure. I think much more needs to be done to support open source encryption tools in this space. I think people are looking for lots of flexibility and opportunities to be able to plug and play that into whether it's cloud solutions or desktop solutions. I think that's something that as a community, we have to find new ways to work on that and new ways to advance that. I think it's interesting when you look at some of the investments in open source, they have been rather small over time, and we have to find a way to sort of shift the balance in that area.
Thank you, Paul. Quick reaction from Rihanna and Raul.
So I think this is an area where governments as stakeholders have a part to play. In terms of standing up for strong encryption, one thing that governments can do is to really put their money where their mouth is. So for example, the way that the Tor browser, which enables people to surf the web anonymously, originated was in part with backing from the United States Department of State. And so I think that's an opportunity where helping to support free and open source software solutions might be something where governments could, instead of retreating from strong encryption, really signal and commit to their support for it by helping out the people who are developing it.
I always forget. Yes, I think that's encryption has been a priority for Internet society for many years. We have contributed to the development of tools and working on standards, design of technologies, in working on all the aspects of this. We support, in fact, some initiatives that are being developed now, big initiatives for providing open source solutions to this. Yes, I think that we can do always more, but we do a lot.
Thank you, Rihanna and Raul. Going to our online participants, thank you for your active discussion in the online space. Jamila, please.
Yes, we have one question here. Can Luis please clarify if he was indicating or if he would agree that governments should share vulnerabilities that are found so the vendors and the public can protect themselves? That these weaknesses shouldn't be kept secret for surveillance purposes but shared to protect users? The user is not identified.
Important question, please.
The question said it all. Yes, of course. Particularly, that's the contradiction between countries that say they are concerned about cybersecurity, but they are being one of the biggest threats to cybersecurity by hoarding this knowledge and not sharing it with the people that can patch it and protect their users. So definitely, this is a complete contradiction, and countries that say the same two lines cannot. I mean, we have to call them out that this is not consistent. Either you are for cybersecurity or you are for hoarding knowledge about how to break into devices that everyone uses.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Luis Fernando. Raul, and then Paul.
Yes, this is a very pertinent question. Of course, the answer is yes, as my colleague already said. And in fact, this is very important to consider now that there are a lot of discussion about lawful hacking. And in fact, Europe has some initiatives for lawful hacking, and I think that it is very important to include in those initiatives, no matter which country is managing that it includes the communication, the reporting to the manufacturers when they find some vulnerabilities in software or equipment. This is essential. As my colleague already said, if we have a commitment with the security, so it is important that when we identify vulnerabilities, we report to the right sources.
No, I think the question was fantastic. From a private sector technology provider, when governments hold vulnerabilities about your product to use for exploitation, it creates a dangerous imbalance, and I think that's a global imbalance. Today, we see many governments who are over-investing in offensive capabilities, and there is not enough investment in defensive capabilities. And I think we do need a multi-stakeholder dialogue about how do we move forward in this space. Someone earlier mentioned the concept of a digital Geneva Convention or some type of norm-setting effort that we begin to take on at an international level. That's something that Microsoft strongly supports and is working very hard to try to open that dialogue with governments. It's not an easy dialogue to begin, but it's one we have to have.
Thank you, Paul. And we can go further with our questions in the room. Please limit your question to 1 minute. Thank you.
I'll make a quick point. I am Rupinder Prahad from Internet Service Providers Association of India, as well as on the Executive Council of APNIC. What I would like to share here is, I have got experience of working alongside the industry as well as with the government also. Now, what I'd like to say here, it is absolutely right for a bank to protect, to encrypt its data when it is doing its business. It's absolutely right for a telecom company when it is dealing with its customers, for an airline, or for any other business when it is only doing the encryption for running its own businesses. But there is a rider here. Now, suppose we are today living in violent times. We have got a large part of the world, we have got governments which are democratically elected. So let's not make the governments into some kind of Frankenstein monsters. After all, these have been elected by us. Now, they have got security agencies. Those security agencies' job is what? To protect its citizens. So if they are to protect their citizens, well, we have got all kinds of people on the net who are out to harm various interests. So if that is so, well, if the governments need to monitor that traffic, well, they need to do it. It's for our benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupinder, for your comment, to which I would like to ask Mokhtar to react, and then Raul.
No, I think the comment is good with regard to the government itself. However, not every government is as responsible as it should be. Yes, we elect them sometimes, but they overpass their competencies. So we need to make sure that we have balances. I am from the government, if I may side, but I believe also that on freedoms and then the freedom of expression, but at the same time, I believe also on security. So we need to put some kind of safeguard for everybody and to make sure that there is a balance. We have system to control the government, what they have to do, but in the same time, we have to make sure that our security is taken care of. Thank you.
Well, this is a very good comment. First of all, just a precision, that most of the population of the world live under non-democratic regimes. And all the democratic regimes are not equally democratic. So this is what I tried to say before. It's very difficult to define who is good and who is not. And democracy, by the way, is not a universal value. So probably there are other countries that are not democratic that claim to have the same legitimacy on this. But the internet is ubiquitous. So it doesn't matter where we break the integrity of the information. It has a global repercussion. So this is the illusion that I spoke about. If we think that one government, because it's a legitimate representative of their citizens, has the right to break the encryption and to access the data of their citizens, we are saying that any government can do it, and not only the governments, as my colleague pointed out. The technologies, once the technologies are available, they are available for everybody. We cannot just put the technologies inside of a safe box and available only for those that we want to use them. So this is I said at the beginning, there are no options in between. Encryption is something that you have it or not.
Thank you, Mokhtar. And Raul, please, over to you.
Thank you. My name is Richard Wingfield. I'm from Global Partners Digital in London, and my question sort of links to a couple of that were already asked. But first, I think it was important to note the trend that has been seen from some governments not to look at measures which necessarily weaken encryption itself, but which undermine its use through lawful hacking or other forms of surveillance. I think the European Commission proposal referred to these techniques as alternative investigation techniques. And so my question really is, should we be as concerned about these alternatives as we are about proposals which weaken encryption itself? And presuming that the answer is yes, are there ways that they can be developed which would be consistent with human rights and the legitimate ambitions of governments to protect us from crime and terrorism and so forth. Is there a solution that would satisfy all parties, do you think?
Thank you very much, Richard. If I got your name well, should we be concerned? Rihanna, would you like to answer that?
So I'd agree that we should be concerned about the use of government hacking techniques, partially for the reasons that Luis mentioned, which is that sometimes these techniques are used by the government acting in its role as bad guys to crack down on journalists, or even, I believe it was proponents of a soda tax in Mexico that Luis did some excellent research about. One thing that I think differentiates the lawful hacking discussion from the crypto discussion is that I think we don't necessarily yet understand the full computer security ramifications of government hacking to quite the same degree as we do the ramifications of undermining encryption, where we've had 2 decades or more of very consistent research and consensus from the cryptographic community about what those risks are. So I think that is something that definitely needs to be taken into consideration by governments that are trying to deploy lawful hacking as a way of doing an end run around encryption rather than trying to break encryption directly. I think that it is difficult to find a solution that satisfies all parties. If it were easy, we wouldn't have to have a big conference like this. And so while a number of cryptographers have pointed to it as a preferable alternative to backdoors for encryption, I think that there is a long way to go before we can get to any place where people can be in any kind of agreement about that, where not only do we need to understand the security ramifications, but we would at the very least need some sort of multi-stakeholder informed policy or regulation that would govern the conduct of governments that use these measures, whether it's the German government or the Mexican government.
Thank you very much, Rihanna. Going to our online participants now, Diego, Jamila, can I ask one of you, please? Diego?
Yes. The question is the following. Are backdoors and other techniques as such effective to increase cybersecurity and protect human rights in tandem?
Thank you. Who would like to address this question, including speakers from other segments?
I'm sorry if I understood the question. Do backdoors?
About backdoors and other techniques as such, whether they are effective to increase cybersecurity and protect human rights in tandem. Okay, Paul.
The answer to that would be no. I think whenever you start to create those types of things in a product, you're creating something that you will lose control of. It will be exploited by purposes you do not intend to, and that has never been a good idea.
Thank you very much, Paul. We have 5 minutes left in this segment. So, Vladimir Radunovic from Diplo Foundation, can you be concise?
Coming back to reality, so we've been talking about the government capabilities for offensive actions and so on. There are many information about that. We just did a mapping of about 20 countries which actually officially say within their formal documents that they have these capacities. We'll publish that map later today at the Digital Watch. But my question is, if that's the fact, can we actually expect that the countries are going to step back? And out of those 20, we have all the nuclear powers and many more across Europe, Africa, and so on. Can we expect that they are going to hear us and step back? Or what is the best alternative that we might possibly ask them to do if they are not going to step back? We have seen the US publishing the vulnerability disclosure process. Is that something? We have seen Switzerland at least saying how they might be using, in what circumstances, offensive cyber capability. Is that something? What the IGF can possibly do, or what is the other field that can possibly do to impact that process? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Vlada, Mr. Garcia, then Mr. Echeverria.
I think if governments are acquiring unprecedented powers to surveil people, they have to accept unprecedented accountability and transparency about how they use. I think it's a basic trade-off that they need to accept. They cannot just hide under the national security phrase and expect that they can use these huge powers in the same secretive manner that they have. If we want to go forward with this and governments want to have these powers, they need to be way more transparent about how they do things than they have before. No?
Yes, exactly. I still dream with peace in the world, even the fact that it looks difficult that some countries give up from developing nuclear weapons, and it's the same. I would say we don't have to accept those technologies using for surveillance. This is something we have to condemn. Even if countries are now have the capacity to do it, yes, I hope they step back, they stop doing. We have to work together on finding solutions for law enforcement agencies. That is a different thing, but protecting the trust on the internet. And as Luis said, if some agencies support lawful hacking, they should be much more transparent. We already covered that in a previous question. They should report what the vulnerabilities they report, and they should report what are the technologies, what are the capacities they have.
Thank you very much. Can I ask the two of you to ask telegraphic questions so that we can tackle them both? Please start and introduce yourself. Thank you.
From Ecuador, could we expect some kind of international instrument in order to, make the governments, but not only the governments, but the companies accountable, but about what they are selling to our countries? I mean, thinking about hacking team in Ecuador. By the way, for the guy in India, our emails, even mine, were published by the government media. So we are not terrorists. Bye.
Thank you, Marta. Please. We will collect these two questions and then tackle them together.
Hi, I'm Bruno Bioni from nick.br, but I'm speaking on my personal capacity. I'd like to follow the same reasoning that was made by Luis Fernando in order to expand our perspective what is at stake on the public debate on cryptography, because I remember from a conjunctural analysis 2, 3 years or 4 years ago, there was a strong and intense debate on data retention. And since that now the public debate on cryptography is blurring the important debate that the data retention should have the same protection as the content of our communication. So I would like to know some thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. Going to Mokhtar to answer Marta's question on international instruments. So what should we practically do?
Well, first of all, let me comment on the previous things with regard to the governments sharing or backing on what they're going to do. And this is, I'm speaking my personal quality, that I don't think that any government today nor institution will be sharing any information with regard to whatever capability they do have. Rather, we are entering into what we call the cyber race, and everybody will be trying actually to make sure that cyber dominance actually is really on top of things. We are actually, I see the metaphor of the Cold War happening with regard to the cyberspace. So having said that, trying to do some kind of international regulations with regard to this kind of things is same thing trying to have a convention, international convention on cybersecurity or on internet governance. And which is actually the moment we open the door for this kind of alternatives, we are entering into a very critical situation that probably will trigger the entire concept of internet as its place for freedom and for innovation and creativity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mokhtar, reacting to the second question, Paul, please. What is at stake at the public debate, relation of cryptography and data retention?
So in terms of, I might alter that slightly. There was the question about, do we need some sort of international instrument? I need to speak into the mic, sorry. In terms of that, I do think there is a lot of discussion and positive direction. It has to start first with the development of actually norms and normative behavior in this space, both for governments, but also for the private sector. That's the only way we're going to make progress in this. Long term, we probably do need an instrument, but we're a long way away from that happening.
Yeah, sorry, we misunderstood each other. I thought you wanted to comment on the second question while you commented on the first one. First, fine. So could I ask you, Luis Fernando, to comment quickly on the second question, and then we will close this segment.
Yeah, I would just say that it's a similar problem. Data retention is a similar problem to the ones that we've been discussing. When data retention is discussed, it says we're just storing the information about a lot of people, and limited access to that data. And again and again, it has been proven that when you create this and you amass these huge amounts of data, they end up being accessed by actors that you were not thinking they were the ones that were going to access it. So we really need to think about see history and see what's. I mean, many of these things we're expecting them to happen. If you store all this information, it will get leaked. If you hoard vulnerabilities, they will get stolen and be used against you. And we need to go forward. And if governments won't accept transparency, then we cannot accept them having these powers.
Thank you very much, not only to you, but please join me in thanking Paul, Rihanna, Raul, Luis Fernando, and Mokhtar for their insights. And we would again need to have a speaker reshuffle, so please take your things. Thank you. Thank you. And I would now like to welcome the speakers for our third segment on data flows. I would like to welcome here Vint, Stefania, Fiona, Andre, and Stefan. And at the same time, I think we should be fine with the seats for Anne and Bertrand, so feel free to join us as well. Thank you. For those that have joined late, welcome to the main session dealing with local actions and global impact in the field of internet disruptions, encryption, and data flows. This is the third and last segment dealing with data flows. Data clearly is crucial for human security, as we know that there are many businesses that rely on data. International cooperation for development also relies on data to increase the effectiveness in which we can also think about the sustainable development goals. And I would like to start this session by giving the floor to Mr. Vint Cerf, who probably needs no introduction, but still for the records, I would like to say that he's the co-designer of the TCP/IP protocols and the architecture of the Internet. He began his work at DARPA, the US Department of Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, playing a key role in leading the development of internet-related data packet and security technologies. Since 2005, Mr. Cerf has served as Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google, and he also helped form ICANN. Mr. Cerf, it's a pleasure to have you here. Could you tell us a bit more about what are the desirable properties of internet ecosystem when it goes to data flows?
Well, let me start out by making an observation about the value of being able to distribute information around the world through the internet. Today, cloud-based systems are used to do a great deal of computation and provide services to people, and the value of being able to distribute that data freely is important because it allows us to replicate the data to preserve its integrity and to assure that it isn't lost. And in a regime in which one is inhibited from moving data from one data center to another across international borders, the ability to protect that information is going to be inhibited or reduced. And so freedom to move data around the world, I think, is a very important feature. The second thing, with regard to the previous segment, is that there is a great deal of insecurity associated with moving this data across borders in the absence of encryption and strong authentication to assure access control and to assure confidentiality in the transfer of the data. And in my world at Google, we also believe in encrypting the data once it is at rest in order to protect against its exposure should someone manage to penetrate into the storage systems. There's another element associated with transborder data flow freedom, and that has to do with the ability to simply interconnect. This notion of being able to link anything to anything else on an end-to-end basis is in fact a core element of the organic expansion of the Internet and the evolution of Internet-based applications and protocols. As we watch the Internet of Things evolving, despite the fact that some of us are very concerned about its potential abuse, the casual ability to say, I can connect this thing to any other thing on the Internet has been quite a powerful tool, because it has allowed applications to be developed without too much concern ahead of time with whether or not connectivity is feasible. And so by removing that concern, we create all kinds of applications that would otherwise not be possible. Finally, with regard to transborder data flow and its inhibition, as soon as this becomes a practice, then we not only risk, but we almost assure the fragmentation of the Internet. And the thing which makes the Internet so valuable is precisely its connectivity and the ability of anything to reach anything else. And so a fragmented Internet isn't the Internet anymore, certainly not in the sense that my colleagues and I have conceived it. So I think I'll stop there, Madam Chairman, because I know you have much to get done.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Cerf, for setting the stage for the discussion on data flows. And we will now continue in our discussions with perspectives from various stakeholder groups. And if you allow me, I would like to start with Mr. André Laperrière, who is the Executive Director of the Secretariat for Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition. And during his career, André has led numerous large-scale projects on behalf of both private corporations and within the United Nations. André, how has data been used in different countries and by intergovernmental organizations from your experience? You have 4 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, the world is full of very creative, very smart people. So as part of GoDan, we are now in just about every country around the world. We're from Argentina to Australia, having partners dealing from genomes to satellites. And what is very interesting is to see at the national, regional, and international level how people can combine their skills, ideas, and how to best share, combine, synergize data together for innovation, food security, and improvement of quality of life of all. I'll just share with you some examples. First, this is just a personal observation. In my lifetime, as yours, I guess, we went through 3 quiet revolutions, which are really changing the shape of the world. The first one was, of course, the Internet, because the Internet connected the world together. So that was an important thing. The second were intelligent phones. Intelligent phones brought the Internet and everything that goes with it, Internet banking, transactions, even in the most remote places where there were no phones, there was no electricity. So people just came up with honky-tonky generators or other ways to recharge their phones, and now they're doing business in the most remote parts of the world. The third revolution rather, is really the culmination of this, and it's open data. That's what we promote as a key tool to promote innovation and agriculture, nutrition, and business in general. And governments are following suit. We have many governments as part of our partnership, as well as private sector entities, and we see them opening up data, making it available to their citizens, which pay for it in any case through their taxes, but also because it's good for business. Now we have banks that are getting involved in open data, so one of the most conservative environments as far as it used to be. big data, which used to be the privilege of big companies, big countries, the richer world is now available through many different forms to small farmers in very local areas. I'm just thinking of examples such applications such as Weed Scout or PlantWise, which allow farmers in the most remote parts of Africa and other Asia and other parts of the world, when they see a disease coming to their maize or whatever they're growing, they can just take a picture of it, and through artificial intelligence, in a fraction of a second, the disease is identified and they get feedback as to what they should do with it. And I'm skipping, of course, weather data, which is becoming more and more important in light of climate change, where they have to adjust the way they do farming. So these are just some examples, but technology is allowing these countries, is allowing the world to leapfrog some development steps. The mobile phones was an example of this. But at the same time, we see other things happening, because in one way, there was a brief period where technology went faster than the human capacity to absorb it. I'm thinking of geodata, for instance, which is extremely important, especially for small countries and others which struggle to afford and to manage things such as basic surveys, which cost a lot and take a long time, and sometimes have to reach places which are difficult to access. Yet geodata is just massive. So until a real short time ago, you needed very large equipment and highly qualified technicians to be able to handle it. Now, through user-friendly research engines and local applications, you can just access the part of the data that you need. You don't even need to download it. Most times you can just process it within the clouds. So technology is allowing access to this big data, to this big cloud that was only reserved to the few before. So that's one thing we find. Though this leads to a few things. My colleague before spoke about encryption, but beyond that, there's the issue of privacy. Of course, the more you open data, the more the question of privacy and ethics related to privacy comes up. And we see a lot of initiatives in various countries around the world and in private sector where this is discussed in very large ways, and where ethics codes are being developed and other means. But yet, there's another element that links to that, which has to do with anonymization, that's how to pronounce, of data, as well as the curation of data, which is another obstacle for local countries to overcome when they deal with data. That's hence the importance of building sound business models, which is one of the things that we, as other international organizations, try to do to help them. There are many others. There's data chasing, other ways that to overcome the fact that you have to chase data constantly to feed in your databases. And the reason why you have to do that is because there's not enough maybe return to those who provide the data. It has to be a balance. Later in the discussion, I hope I have a chance to give you examples of what's being done in Thailand and other places on that.
Thank you.
I have only 4 minutes, so I'll just hold it there, but I hope there'll be some questions because I have many exciting things to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre, and sorry for the pressure. We certainly will hope to get to the Q&A. That's why we want to limit the interventions for 4 minutes. Thank you. I will now go to some perspectives from the academia, and I would like to ask Ms. Stefania Milan, who is the Associate Professor of New Media and Digital Culture at the University of Amsterdam, and also an Associate Professor of Media and Innovations at the University of Oslo. Her research explores the interplay between digital technology and participation, activism, and social movements, in particular in the space of cyberspace governance and data epistemologies. Stefania, we are sitting here at the IGF. So coming to the context of the Internet Governance Forum, can multi-stakeholder dialogue be useful for the problems that we have mapped here? And is the current model actually fit for that?
Thank you very much, Therese, and to all the organizers of this very rich session so far. So I would like to address a little bit of an abstract question and a different way of thinking the relation between local and global. I mean, what we are trying to discuss in this session today. So when we talk about data flows today, we cannot ignore that there are sort of new data controllers and new ways of translating data flows into practice. And here I refer to the role of platforms such as Twitter and Facebook. And I don't want to single out any of them particularly, but I'm just providing examples to help you think about. what I'm talking about. So these social media platforms increasingly mediate our relations as well as various transactions, including, for example, economic transactions. And what's more, for most of the younger generations, for example, my students, platforms are today the internet, really. And not just in developing countries where maybe you have different versions of different limited options. Universities, including one of the one where I work, often force students to be, for example, on Facebook to interact with their teachers. And so we entrust all these platforms with a lot of private data and private relations as well. One of my colleagues in Amsterdam, Anne Helmond, has called it the platformization of the web, to indicate, and I quote, the rise of the platform as the dominant infrastructure and economic model of the social web. What is it about? Well, it's about the extension of social media platforms into the rest of the web and their drive to make external web platform ready. Think, for example, about how Facebook and Google have become identity providers. And for example, you need to have an account of this, with these companies in order to access many other services like, for example, public Wi-Fi networks. Now, we have already heard at the very opening of today's session from Melody and Henriette, if I remember correctly, that the state, for what concerns internet disruption, remains the main actor there. And the fact that in many countries the state instructs regulators somehow blows up, jeopardizes the multi-stakeholder model. And this is indeed true, and I believe it also is true, increasingly true when it comes to platforms and private companies that are playing a dominant role in the data market. And I believe that this is a very important question for a space like this one today, and Internet Governance Forum more in general. So if we observe a rise of self-regulation and private contracting, and this privatization, data flows, and their regulation management stays largely outside the multi-stakeholder model, in the sort of gray areas, which is often inaccessible to final users. We really need to interrogate whether the current model that we are so fond of, because we play it and we have seen it being very effective in many occasions, is indeed what we need looking forward. So really, we ought to ask ourselves whether current internet governance mechanisms, most notably the multi-stakeholder model, are fit for the challenge. Take, for example, the terms of service. These are as they should be, because this is something that regulates access to a private space like someone else's living room. These are private agreements between users and platform owners, and they are well beyond the remit and the reach of multi-stakeholder debates. So what does this all mean for internet governance frameworks and processes? Do this type of regulation is accompanied by adequate safeguards, for example, the same safeguards that, for example, governments are abide to under national and international law policy? What is changing there, in a way? And in order not to conclude, so it's a bit of a gloomy picture that I painted here. I believe we have a major, major challenge ahead of us that we really should think about. Many of these companies, luckily, are here with us, but we also know that the people that might be with us might not be the ones who actually at the end create the infrastructure or set the rules for their enjoyment. So what's the way forward to be less, to be a little more optimistic and not just paint a gloomy picture? Well, I mean, it's nothing new. We have already heard it in the 2 hours that precede this section of this session. So more transparency. We need more transparency on the side of the companies. We need more literacy, which is something that I believe has not really come up yet. And that's not something that maybe the multi-stakeholder model can do as such, but I think this is a space that this is something that the Internet Governance Forum is anyway very much concerned with, and also many of the players that are sitting at the table today. And ultimately something, and I'm sorry to repeat it again, but as the last session, it's sort of inevitable not to repeat things. We need much more accountability mechanisms that goes in various directions. And ultimately, I do believe that we need to rethink a little bit the multi-stakeholder model. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefania, also for bringing some insights from your research. Let's take an advantage of the fact that we will have some perspectives from the technical community here. And I would like to ask now lady on my right, Ms. Fiona Asonga, who is the CEO of the Kenya Internet Exchange Point and the Telecommunications Service Providers Association of Kenya. Her role involves ensuring internet uptake locally and value addition in the use of the internet to the local community. Fiona, we have been speaking, or will be speaking even more about the use of data in different countries. Give us some perspectives from Kenya.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Good afternoon, everyone. We have basically looked at all the issues that facilitate for data transfer that are important in data flow and data sharing. And the Kenyan perspective is that there are two ways of looking at it. One, from a government point of view, where government has gone full throttle to ensure that it's able to offer services online, and as such, business has had to adjust their strategies to be able to look at the opportunities that this provides and to align and fit in. So having done that since 2015, in 2014 we found ourselves, 2016 we found ourselves with having to put together a multi-stakeholder group that developed what we call in Kenya the ICT Master Plan. And in that document, we have looked at how we can work together with government, as private sector, with government, to ensure that government is able to access the data that it needs digitally, bearing in mind that governments have collected this data over years in manual forms, whether it is death, birth, marriage, asset ownership. All this data is already with our governments. The only difference is that when it now gets onto an online space, it has to be handled differently. And so what we did was to put in place mechanisms to ensure that we could first get all this data online. And the government began to offer services through a platform we call the Huduma services. Huduma means help. And basically, government is helping the citizens get access to government services. And we've got what we call the Huduma centers that are spread across the country. At these centers, you have the opportunity to clarify your birth and birth registration details. You have the opportunity to register your children who are born, to register your marriage, to pay for your business licenses, to pay for your electricity, water bills. So we sort of have, like in Nairobi, which is the largest county and the most advanced county, it is a one-stop shop for all your electronic government business transactions. So the government is already collecting this data. What has private sector done? Private sector has participated in ensuring that the standards and credentials of how that data is handled are right. So we have sat down with government to be very clear on processes, internal standards of who should access the data, how should the data change, how should it be handled, so that when I register my car, someone else doesn't go in and change my car registration details and give themselves the car. So even when I'm transferring an asset, it is very clear on how the transfer has to be handled. If it is land, it's very clear how that has to be handled. And the rules that have been put in place so far have been followed over the last 2 years that the Huduma service centers have been operational. And that has demonstrated that we are able to work together in a multi-stakeholder arrangement to ensure privacy is adhered to, yet the data is still available for the respective government agencies that need to access. So the fact that someone is a civil servant doesn't mean they have access to that data. They have to be authorized. They have to have the right credentials. In the absence of that, then they have breached. It's a cybersecurity breach, and they get dealt with like any other civilian who will be found hacking into the databases. So we are very clear on how that is handled, and this has enabled us to be able to improve and expand the system. We've got a digital learning program that enables our educational content to be available online for the teachers to be able to access and the students to access and to do this online. And as such, even when we had the examinations, as opposed to us having to shut down the internet because we had challenges with exam leakage, we told the security agents to just make sure no entering the exam room with electronic devices, because you don't need them in the exam room. And this is an example of how we've been able to work and ensure that the right data is handled by the right people, is used for the right purposes, and the internet serves and the technology serves what it's supposed to serve in the right way. We know that there may be some challenges, but even then, the challenges are easier to solve when we are working together as private sector, business, technical community, and the government on for one goal. Thanks.
Thank you, Fiona, for the perspectives from Kenya, very relevant for our discussion. Going to another country perspective, I would like now to ask Mr. Stefan Schnorr to take the floor. Before I do that, we will have our Q&A session after Stefan's contribution. No, I have not forgotten Bertrand and Anne sitting with us, but they will then provide a kind of conclusion covering all segments after the Q&A, dealing specifically with data flow. So if you want to ask your question, in case you have come late, let me remind you that we have a queuing system, so you should come here in front on my right to ask your question or give us a comment. Now, back to the session flow on data flows. Mr. Stefan Schnorr leads the Department of Digital and Innovation Policy at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. He has been at the ministry since 2010 and leading the department since 2014. Stefan, in Germany, can you tell us a bit more on the approaches and you follow in Germany on the free movement of data and data protection? And please elaborate also on the local to global aspects. 4 minutes for you.
Teresa, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you today. The principle of free movement of data is indeed essential to Germany. Our strong economy and our export-driven companies depend on a free flow of information around the globe. Our democracy, which is underpinned by the rule of law, depends on a free flow of data for lively debates and discussions and to allow people to form an informed opinion. Civil society work in support of old people, environmental protection, neighborhood aid and many other causes depend on the free exchange of information. Our strong science community in Germany also depends on being able to network with their colleagues around the globe whenever they need to do it. And our development and humanitarian actors need the free flow of data to fulfill their important tasks around the world. This is why we support the principle of having a free and global movement of data, similar to what has been set out in the agreements on the free movements of goods, services and capital. But we also have to protect our citizens' legitimate interests when it comes to data protection and security. What role can international organizations play in this situation? Are they a part of a problem or are they a part of the solution? I want to highlight these questions with the example of the European General Data Protection Regulation. It has been argued that the European Union is stopping the free flow of data because the GDPR regulates data exports in third countries. Our understanding is that a high level of data protection and a data security is a precondition for a free flow of data and not a barrier to it. The GDPR explicitly provides for the principle of free movement of personal data within the European Union, and the GDPR also provides for personal data to be transmitted to states outside the European Union. However, this is subject to the following conditions. Either the European Commission must have found that the third country provides for a sufficient level of data protection, or the private sector companies involved must take security safeguards that have been approved by the Data Protection Authority, or the requirements must have been met in another way, in particularly by a contract covering the flow of data or by consent given by the person whose data is affected. The example of the GDPR shows that European and international organizations can help to strike a good balance between the need for a free flow of data and data protection, which are both very important. Once the GDPR enters into force in May 2018, we will see what further adjustments may be needed to guarantee just this balance. To work out this, the government will depend on the input of civil society, industry and science, and the Internet Governance Forum is, in my opinion, just the right place to discuss it. And this is why Germany has applied the host to host the 2019 IGF conference in Berlin, and also very important, in June 2019, my ministry, the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs, will also host the Internet and Jurisdiction Conference, and Bertrand de la Chapelle is here with us. We are convinced that this meeting will deliver important outcomes that can feed into the IGF 2019, so we have a lot of work to do up to 2019 together with you and together in the multi-stakeholder approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stefan, for giving us also the outlooks of the discussion, how they can be taken forward at the IGF in Germany in 2 years. While you are making your way, dear participants, to comment or intervene in the session to the microphone up front, Mr. Cerf has alerted me throughout the session that there is one important aspect that we haven't touched upon in the debate yet. Please.
Oh, thank you, Teresa. This has to do with data integrity. In addition to protecting access to the data, making sure the data isn't altered is important. Tuomas Ilves, the former president of Estonia, makes the point very simply. He says that he's not so worried about other people seeing his medical information. He's worried that someone will change his blood type in the record so that if he needs a transfusion, this might be fatal. So I want to emphasize how important it is for us to keep in mind that the integrity of information is just as important as its ability to cross borders and be accessible.
Thank you very much. I would like now to ask our online moderator, Jamila, to please ask a question from the remote participants.
Thank you, Teresa. This question has a strong link between this session and the previous one on encryption. It asks, while governments are beginning to understand that weakening encryption brings security threats and harms human rights, some are moving towards surveillance through metadata. How can countries develop proper safeguards to this type of surveillance once metadata can also reveal sensitive information about citizens?
Thank you. The question of metadata and government's responsibilities in this respect. Are there speakers at this panel who would like to address this? Speakers from the previous two segments are very welcome to do so too. I will first ask André and then you, Mr. Cerf.
Encryption is a very important issue because it has to do with a couple of things. One, it has to do with the protection of data, which for legitimate purposes is reasonable, and the misuse of encryption for not so legitimate purposes, which is, I think, a different kind of issue. But I would just like to say a word on the importance of protecting privacy, protecting data. We often have these discussions especially with commercial or research entities, for which recuperating their initial investment in research is the only way for them to reinvest again in further research. So there has to be a mechanism to protect that kind of privacy, which is not necessarily encryption. It can be some other mechanism, in fact, which I think would be more transparent. And second, the individual protection. I appreciate your flexibility in disclosing your medical records, but some other people don't feel equally comfortable about that. And I mean, it's a matter of being able to choose to have some control over your personal data. And for this, we encourage private companies as well as governments and civil society to be more aware of this, to insist on ethics codes. And as far as the governments are concerned, because they do have a lot of information on their citizens, so to have a basic set of rules that will, while allowing the aggregation of data, aggregation of medical data is important to detect epidemics, for example, but while protecting individual privacy.
Thank you very much, André. Vint?
So this is a tricky problem. Metadata is sometimes considered to be somehow anonymous or not revealing of any particular identity, and yet we also know about the re-identification problem, where data which appears to have been anonymized is reunited with information outside of that database in order to recover the identity of the party about whom the data refers. I don't have a magic wand to fix this problem, and I think, in fact, the computer science community says that this is an unsolvable problem. that you, if you do have extra information which you can recombine with the data, then you are capable of revealing personal information. So I don't think that we can separate the metadata problem from the more general problem of protecting personal information and otherwise anonymized information.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Please, if you can introduce yourself briefly.
Got it. Catherine Townsend, Africa Open Data Collaboratives. I wanted to ask the whole panel, probably Dr. Cerf a bit, about the role of the government's responsibility in ISP regulation and internet company regulation with net neutrality, as has just happened with the United States. That's affecting data flows, and that's affecting the kinds of business growth that can happen, particularly for small businesses, and the implications, as we said, of even if you are a democracy and if you're a leading country and you promise that you will have that you will respect people's rights, that other countries will easily follow suit. So what is the implication for other countries, and what can the global community do to protect? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this timely question. Mr. Cerf, please.
I'm not sure that I'm happy to be the beneficiary of that question. First of all, I would argue that the battle is not over. The whole question of net neutrality, which is a question that varies from country to country, so we should be very careful not to misunderstand the use of the term net neutrality as interpreted in different parts of the world. But in the U.S., the net neutrality was largely to do with inhibiting anti-competitive behavior in an environment in which there wasn't very much competition among the providers of broadband service. And as all of you know, the FCC made a partisan partisan vote to eliminate the net neutrality provisions that the previous FCC had introduced. There is very clear evidence that responses to that are already underway, in some cases lawsuits, in other cases the application of what was called the Congressional Review Act, which would essentially allow the Congress to examine the decision made by the FCC. There's even another possible outcome, which is the introduction of legislation to change the Telecom Act, which governs the FCC's responsibilities to incorporate a new title that's specific to Internet, which might incorporate the net neutrality provisions which had been erased. This is really an issue all around the world in various and sundry forms, and it's one that I hope we do not give up trying to introduce in forms that will ensure freedom of access to the Internet and essentially avoid inhibiting that freedom.
Thank you very much. Stefan?
Yeah, thank you very much. I also think that net neutrality is one of the key points for the free Internet, and I absolutely agree what Vincent said. As you know, we also had in Europe a very intensive debate about net neutrality, and since 2016 we have the first net neutrality regulation, and this is complemented by guidelines by BEREC, the body of European regulators. This legal framework guarantees for Europe the equal treatment of all data, but it also allows exceptions within very narrow limits, such as traffic management. The European legal basis must prove now that they are future-orientated and cover the current and future requirements. The European Commission, will give a report about the experience with this regulation in May next year. In Germany, we have the first case now we discuss about net neutrality. This is an offer from Deutsche Telekom. It's called Stream On, and it's a 0 rating for video and music streaming. And the problem is that our national regulatory authority wants to forbid this offer from the Deutsche Telekom. There are 2 points. First, you have a 0 rating only in Germany, but not in whole of Europe. And we have the roaming regulation in Europe, roam like home, so you have to give the same possibility in other European countries. This is the first point. And the second point is that in this system, and this is very interesting to discuss, the data transfer rate for video streaming is reduced to 1.7 megabit. And so in some tariffs, not in all tariffs of the telecom. And so we have the discussion if this throttling of the data transfer is allowed within the net neutrality regulation. And our regulatory body, the Bundesnetzagentur, says no, and the Deutsche Telekom says yes. And now the courts have to decide this very important question. And I think this is the first, in my opinion, the first discussion we have about the net neutrality regulation, if it works or if it not works. And the court have to decide now. And I think the Commission will take this into account when they give their first report in next year. So the discussion is very intensive, and we will have to look.
Thank you very much for that. With your intervention here, I would like to close the data flows segment, and now would like to ask our two last speakers to reflect on all three previous topics that we have covered here. The issues of internet disruptions, the issues of encryption, and the issue of data flows. I would first like to ask Ms. Anne Carblanc, who is the Principal Administrator in the Information, Computer and Communications Policy Division at the OECD, where she has been responsible for policy issues concerning the protection of personal data and privacy already since 1997, and was previously also a judge in charge of criminal investigations at the Tribunal of Paris. And we have tackled three issues here. But are actually not all these topics that we discussed about data flows? And what is the role of international organizations in tackling these issues?
Thank you very much, and welcome to all.
And sorry to interrupt, 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it was a very interesting session, and now the issue is about what international organizations can do to improve strategies, outreach, and effectiveness in the three areas that were discussed. I would start by saying that first, these international organizations can help in terms of process. Why? Because by definition, international organizations operate in a multilateral fashion, but at the OECD, we bring together member countries, observer countries, civil society, business, trade unions, and the technical community. And this collaboration in the policy work provides the flexibility and the global scalability which is required to effectively address digital transformation policy challenges. OECD work is driven by committees, and these committees consist of representatives from these different stakeholders. OECD is also a consensus-driven organization, and its policy recommendations are the result of a collaborative, inclusive efforts, very often called soft law. Now, in terms of outputs, and I will speak only for my organization at this point, but I would like first to start by saying that if we take a broad approach, from our perspective at the OECD, the three topics discussed in this session, so internet disruptions, encryption, and data flows, are all related to internet openness. Openness is vital for the internet to provide all its benefits. The internet was fundamentally designed to be open and global, which has enabled it to become an engine of economic growth and innovation. The internet can be open in multiple ways and to varying degrees. The dimensions of openness include technical, we had some examples, economic and social factors, such as market conditions, governance, legal environment, we discussed privacy, procedures, and human rights. Openness is influenced by the decisions made by all actors, governments, but also businesses and individuals. And openness is also influenced by the multi-stakeholder process that drives much of internet policy making. Among the pressures and the trends which affect openness, we can count internet disruptions, tensions around encryption and data flows. And all three issues have the potential to greatly affect, positively or negatively, trust in the digital era. Support for internet openness is grounded in a council recommendation of the OECD, which dates back to 2011, called Principles for Internet Policymaking. This instrument includes a consensus view that internet openness leads to economic and social benefits, and it identifies a suite of mutually reinforcing goals for promoting the openness and the dynamism of the internet. One implication is that internet disruptions, such as deliberate shutdowns by governments, impose economic and social costs on economies and societies. A targeted study by the OECD done in 2011 on the economic impact of shutting down internet and mobile phone services in Egypt showed that the direct economic effect of a 5-day shutdown was a loss of $90 million US, or between 3 and 4% of Egypt's GDP on an annual basis. And this only refers to the revenues that were lost due to the blocked telecommunications and internet services. It didn't take into account the secondary impact that were suffered by loss of business. I take from the discussion on this issue of internet disruption that there is a need for action at national, regional, and at global level. Because there are significant economic and social consequences stemming from internet disruptions, the OECD could contribute to a multi-stakeholder effort to keep one global internet and to protect it from disruption through mechanisms that would include and ensure transparency, proportionality, and due process, including recourse and redress, all basic requirements which are in line with OECD fundamental values. So I thank very much Henriette who commented on the recent call for protecting the core of the internet, but maybe it's not only the core of the internet that needs to be protected from disruption. So we stand ready to help. OECD has also developed soft law instruments directly relevant to the topics that we discussed. All these instruments developed with all stakeholders aim to find a balance, an appropriate policy mix. And you all know that compromise is always the essence of, I would say, success at least, or progress. For example, the OECD cryptography guidelines, which were developed 20 years ago, 1997, and have been reviewed on a regular basis, provide an international consensus on how to promote the use of cryptography to foster confidence in the digital environment without unduly jeopardizing public safety, law enforcement, and national security. I'm sure you recognize the two branches of the balance. Its 8 principles were developed following very intense discussions among all stakeholders. These principles recognize that national cryptography policy may allow lawful access to plain text, to cryptographic keys, or to encrypted data. But they also say that these policies must respect the other principles in the guidelines to the greatest extent possible, including that cryptographic methods should be trustworthy. The guidelines also underline the liability issue, saying that whoever has access to cryptographic keys should become liable in case of security breach affecting the keys. And they also bring the need to respect privacy and the right to choose cryptographic methods, as well as the need for international cooperation to avoid that cryptography policies become an obstacle to trade. Another example of an instrument is the Council recommendation on digital security risk management. And this was stressed by Microsoft, Mr. Nicolas, who said that approaching digital security solely from a technical perspective doesn't work. You need to include social and economic considerations, and that needs to be part of a decision by, for instance, in companies, the boards. In terms of the discussion, what I took was that the question of how to enable law enforcement access without undermining trust is still the key question. But so far, in practice, nobody has identified how to provide law enforcement access to encryption keys without damaging trust in cryptographic methods. So OECD agrees with ISOC that collaborative security is likely to be the way forward, and this could be an element to add to the recommendation in the future. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sorry for the pressure. Thank you very much, Anne, for your reflections and sharing the work of your organizations in this respect. I would like now to go to Mr. Bertrand de la Chapelle, who is the Executive Director of the Global Multi-Stakeholder Policy Network, Internet and Jurisdiction. He's the former member of the Board of Directors at ICANN. He was France's thematic ambassador and special envoy for the Information Society, participating in all with his follow-up activities in IG processes. Bertrand, please try to reflect on what we have discussed at this session and help us looking forward on the issue, on the question of what are the solutions, where to go from here. You have 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For a lot of people here, it's an amazing feeling to be in this particular room where we have spent so many hours during the preparation of the World Summit on the Information Society, the CSTD sessions, and so on. And at least there has been an incredible improvement, which is that the furniture has been dramatically changed. Anyway, I hope the substance, and I think more seriously, the session that we just had shows clearly an element of improvement, because I think the way the problems were addressed was significantly different from the way it has been addressed in the past. And I want to highlight a certain number of elements, drawing also on the lessons in the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network since 2012, regarding how does multi-stakeholder things work, basically, because we're all asking for a multi-stakeholder cooperation on those issues. But how do you do it concretely is always a challenge. So a few points, and the discussion was very enlightening in that regard. The first one is, I think we can all agree that the topics we're addressing are actually complex dynamic questions, and just like we say complex dynamic systems. We use words like unintended consequences, collateral damage, dynamic movements of actors, and this is what makes those issues so difficult, because of the multiplicity of actors that have to be engaged and the interpenetration of sorts of measures that are taken in one dimension for security matters and the impact that they may have on other issues in the economic dimension, for instance. Another element that was striking was the comment that Paul was making regarding the new era around encryption of absolute privacy. There are considerable consequences to those technical evolutions that have policy challenges as well. So first element is those issues have to be addressed in a sort of holistic manner by looking at the different dimensions. This is the main fundamental justification for a multi-stakeholder approach. You need to have the whole picture, and you need to move beyond, we all need to move beyond the framing of the problem in terms of, I'm the government, I have a problem with the companies. The companies, I'm a company, I have a problem with the government. The civil society doesn't like what, no. These are valid questions, but the real problem is that those are issues that people have to address in common. There are common challenges. And I want to highlight one word. We hear very often words like balance or trade-off in those things. In the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network and the Secretariat, we try to push as much as possible for the wording reconciling competing objectives. Because in many cases, all sides are right in what they care about. And for instance, even on the debate on encryption, as was mentioned in one of the interventions afterwards, and even on shutdowns or disruptions, there are challenges of public order. There are challenges of security that touches human right in a big way when people are harmed. And so how we reconcile those competing objectives is a major challenge that can only be handled by the different actors around the same table. The next element was not necessarily mentioned explicitly, but I think it was underlying most of the interventions. We're living in a world of extreme legal uncertainty and growing legal uncertainty. We don't know exactly how the national laws apply in a cross-border digital environment. Who is actually setting the norms? There's a combination of international instruments, national laws, terms of service of companies, and all those mechanisms interplay with sometimes situations of conflict, where you are in the position of a company, have to abide by different national laws that are not necessarily compatible, or are trying to accommodate different levels of legal commitments. So this question of the environment of legal uncertainty can only be addressed if we move beyond this sort of siloed approach and what we sometimes and often label as a prisoner's dilemma type of situation, where every single actor is trying to solve the problem from its own perspective, which means for governments adopting a particular law, for the companies adopting particular rules for their own services. But the problem of the cumulative effect of uncoordinated actions provides and brings unintended consequences that are detrimental actually for all different aspects. They can be at the same time detrimental for human rights, for cybersecurity, and for the digital economy. And a particular topic that was not directly addressed, but I think is clearly in the context of the discussion we have here, is the whole debate about mandatory data localization, for instance, which is a very important issue. But beyond explaining what the problems are or the challenges, I want to highlight one element. We have a tendency to discuss a lot the symptoms and the problems that are raised by the actions that are taken in reaction to situations. But I want to highlight, for instance, that the whole debate about, for instance, disruptions or shutdowns, if you think about the most classical examples that we have, like the blocking of WhatsApp or the blocking of YouTube or things like that, they're actually measures that are adopted, whether we like it or not, in reaction or in frustration because other problems are not solved. And the other problems particularly are, how do you handle cross-border access to e-evidence in the cloud when the data is stored beyond your borders? That's a very fundamental jurisdictional challenge. Just like for content, the question is, what is the respective responsibilities and the geographic scope of the content suspension? So what I want to highlight is we are in an environment where there is an obligation for coordination in order to bring policy coherence, because a lot of actors are doing addressing the same problem. The second element is there is a need for more than coordination. There is a need for cooperation frameworks. You were asking for solutions. Solutions are actually policy standards and cooperation frameworks that have to be developed not just by series of panels, however important, this is a kind of reporting, but what is needed is processes. And I'm very grateful to Stefan Schnow for mentioning the Global Internet and Jurisdiction Conference in Berlin, which actually will be the third. And the second one will take place in Ottawa in February, 2018, in partnership with the Canadian government. And I just want to highlight this process as one example on 3 issues regarding cross-border access to user data, content takedown, and domain suspensions that illustrate how there is a need to bring the different actors together in an ongoing process with appropriate support. Any additional information can be provided in the session that we have on Thursday at 9 o'clock in room 9. You're all welcome to attend, and please come to the booth. But it was a fascinating session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bertrand, for that. Just to add, there are a number of sessions that are coming up at the IGF dealing with some of the issues we've tackled at this session. So please consult the program if you want to get deeper in that. I hope that this main session has helped us all to provide some views on the regional policy initiatives that do impact the global environment. I also hope that it has helped to map the outlooks and challenges for the multi-stakeholder cooperation in this respect. I would like now to thank the speakers from this panel, namely Bertrand, Fiona, Vint, Stefania, Stefan, Andre, and Anne for their excellent contributions. Thank you. I would certainly want to thank the team that has been behind this session, namely the MEC facilitators, Professor Flavio Wagner, who is the Professor for Computer Science and Engineering at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, and my dear colleague Virginia Pak, who is joining this session remotely. Thank you very much to them. Thank you also to Diego Canabaro and Jamila Venturini, who have not only been the bridge with the online participants at this session, but also instrumental in putting this session together. And last but not least, I would like to thank you, participants at this session, remote and here in the room, who have participated both actively and passively. Thank you for staying for the free hours, and have a good rest of the day and rest of the IGF.